Well, is there any what's is sending Krylev? Does this mean that the Russians still believe that there's a deal somewhere on the table that could be had?
I
I mean,
have heard the suggestion that actually it was the Americans who asked Krylev to come.
really?
Yes. Now, I
Who made
cannot.
that suggestion? Because it seemed that he went immediately when the sanctions were passed and the
Yeah,
Budapest summit was killed.
yes, but there are, of course, people, even a minority, a fringe number of people within the United States, even within the MAGA movement, that would seek to improve relations with Russia. And I would imagine that it's those interests that has invited him. If that's the situation, it doesn't necessarily mean that he is there. I have not heard about him speaking with Trump or
Right.
or JD Vance or anyone who could conceivably matter, but I don't know who else that would be, frankly, because. But other than that, I really can't honestly tell you. I do not get the sense that this is, some type of Kremlin attempt to reach out one last time to the
I
Trump
see.
administration. The statements by Putin hasn't mentioned Trump by name in a couple of weeks now. And in all of Putin's recent public engagements, he has not talked about any diplomatic process whatsoever.
So does that mean that they have finally come to the conclusion the United States is, let's say, diplomacy adverse to anything short of us
Diplomacy incapable. Yeah.
Yes.
I think there's people within the Kremlin that have long held that view. In fact, I know there's people within the Kremlin, within the Russian decision-making bodies, within the Russian National Security Council, which is the Politburo, because Putin is quite obviously first, shall we say, among equals. I don't even know if it's first among equals, but he doesn't have complete power in Russia.
Right.
However, people might try to present it otherwise, and the Russian National Security Council functions. These are the major, not only on military, but foreign policy, and increasingly even on domestic issues. It is the figures who are within the National Security Council that are the political decision makers in Russia. And Putin is first at that table, but he's not the only one. And I think that Putin, has been his cautious, people, in the West have continually talked about, oh, we get rid of Putin, and then that'll be it. And of course, the reality is Putin is among the most, the most moderate, the potentially, the one of those who is willing to have some type of accommodation with the West. There are plenty of others who are not at all. That hope of Putin's of some type of diplomatic settlement to this, right? I think has gone up in smoke. And Putin, if he still has those views, is now cognizant enough of what the situation is, not to even talk about it in public anymore, because it actually decreases his credibility and approval as a leader at this point, because the Russian people have had enough of this games with Trump. They are impatient, and they why are we doing this? Why are we bothering to play this game? Why is Putin still being polite to him? And why don't we send Dmitry Medvedev to negotiate with him? I mean, that's the attitude that I think has been rising up. The Russian public, the Russian media, and in a considerable portion of the actual Russian decision-making elite, that have long held that particular view. Lavrov and Shoigu and others.
So does that affect the way the war is prosecuted?
Sure. I mean, it has to. I mean, I believe it was always headed in that direction, that was an inevitability. But now it's, I think, clearer that there's simply not going to be any alternatives. In last week, domestically, Russia passed a law allowing the calling up of reservists, which has not been done since 2022, right? Russia's military there was one call up of reservists in the autumn of 2022 when it became clear that the initial Istanbul communique was another Minsk hoax, being played on the Russians, and that there was going to be no diplomatic settlement. There never was intended to be one. And that it was going to be a bitter proxy war against all of NATO and the collective West. Then Russia, having not mobilized and sending a very small intervention force, 150,000, right, which was already outnumbered by the regular Ukrainian military by 100,000, and the Kiev regime mobilized on paper 1 million people over those few months, and Russia did nothing, and then they had to withdraw from Kherson and Kherson City and Kharkov, right? To shorten their lines while they began the process of beginning a contract campaign to recruit people. But they had to call up 300,000 military reservists out of 2 million. And they did so. But that was the last reservists they've called up. But last week, they passed a law in the Duma, signed off by the president, allowing them at some point to call up more reservists. And this is specifically for the purpose, right now, at least that's what's being talked about, of defending Russia's infrastructure, the oil refineries and other things.
I see.
Right. And that, of course, would free up Russian troops to be used in Ukraine. Right. And I don't believe that's the last such measure, because the Russian military is perfectly capable of finishing the special military operation in Donbass, and probably in Kherson and Zaporozhye, and maybe even the entire West Bank, right, the East Bank of the Dnieper River. But to go beyond that, Russia's going to need more. The volunteer contract soldier pool will probably not be enough, and they'll probably have to call up, I don't know, another 1 million reservists at some point if they have to occupy all of Ukraine.
Which is part of the reason for that law. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, Russia already had another 300,000 waiting in reserve that they weren't using.
They still do. I mean, I have not heard, the Financial Times reported on that, and I have not heard that they have been used yet. So I don't know whether they have or not, but I haven't heard anything about it. But yeah, beyond that, they'll still need more. Of course, Ukraine is a big country.
Wow. Speaking of that, the two new missile systems, the Poseidon, which, again, terrifying weapon, and the Burevestnik. Thank you.
Burevestnik means storm petrel, a type of bird.
The type of bird. It came from a poem. I was educated on that by Jeff Rich, where he was explaining the poem to me. There was this kind of workers.
Yeah, a good way of translating it, for if you're not familiar with birds. I'm a birder myself, so Stormbringer.
Yeah, Stormbringer. Yeah,
Stormbringer. Yeah. That's a good way of thinking, because the petrel in folklore is a bird associated with heralding storms. So
Stormbringer. So why are these weapons introduced? What was the entire point of displaying and deploying these weapons now?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, these weapons have long been, they were announced back in 2018, by President Putin, that they were in development, or in military terms, the final stages of development. But now it's been very publicly announced that they're going into production and deployment, which is, of course, meaning they are fully completed. But they were obviously as a response to the U.S. idea of escalating militarily with the Tomahawk. That was, I mean, it's pretty blatantly obvious that was the warning. It's not that Russia is afraid of the Tomahawk as a system. They're not, right? The Tomahawk is a 1980s Top Gun. It was a good cruise missile back then, and I'm sure it's received updates by now, but it's nowhere even close as advanced as the Storm Shadow or the Scalp, and Russia has dealt with them as it's dealt with the ATACMS, the ground launched small diameter bomb, and everything else that the U.S. has thrown. That headline out of the Western media last year: the West's high tech weapons work against Russia until they don't, right? Until Russia adapts, right? Until Russian electronic warfare and air defenses, quickly develop a profile and adapt, and then those weapons are useless hunks of metal floating through space without any GPS signal, or actually physically shot down. So the Tomahawk does have a longer range than the Storm Shadow or the Scalp, right? But it is a slower, heavier, less stealthy weapon. Russians aren't terribly, I don't think they're terribly impressed with it. It's more just having, on a political level, to take in the possibility that there is theoretically the possibility that they could be equipped with a nuclear warhead, and there's no way to tell. I mean, I don't believe that the U.S. would fire a nuclear tipped cruise missile, at Moscow. Not in this situation. But the Russian military can't be so sanguine and just accepting and assuming that. But more than that, it's, again, we're back to where we were in December of last year when Joe Biden's corpse was still in the White House. And Blinken and Sullivan were firing ballistic missiles into Russia, and Russia was about ready to respond until Donald Trump, as the incoming president, spoke up and said, "That's crazy. I would never do that. That's World War III." And then they're like, "All right, hold. All right, this crew is shuffling out in a month here. We'll wait for our response." And Trump didn't do it. Didn't fire missiles.
Right.
Up until now, right? And even the Storm Shadows and Scalps, which have to, require U.S. satellite data, stopped until 2 or 3 weeks ago now. So that to get back to that level of escalation, Russia doesn't want the West openly firing missiles. I mean, let's drop the fig leaf, the pretext that they would provide the weapons to the Kiev regime, right? Trump said it himself openly now that it would require American specialists to fire these weapons, right? So let's dispense with that entire, long-held fig leaf, right? That would be the United States. That would effectively be Donald Trump himself pushing the big red button, firing missiles into Russia. And that is a political escalation that Russia cannot, cannot accept. So they unveiled these weapons in a very public way. And these are interesting weapons. I've heard them referred to in the New York Times as science fiction weapons. I've heard them referred to as exotic weapons.
Doomsday weapons.
Doomsday weapons, right?
Yeah.
Certainly the Poseidon. I mean, if it can really do what they say and create a radioactive tsunami to inundate not just one city, but an entire coast, that sort of thing. To me, the most interesting capability that they are both capable of, right? First of all, they're obviously they were created after and as a response to the U.S. pulling out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty back in 2003 unilaterally, and beginning the construction of missile defense in Romania and Poland. And Putin warned He warned at Munich in 2007. And since then, you do that, and we will have to take steps to return strategic parity, right? Because that is, even if not now, that is in some future time when you actually get that missile defense to work properly, some level of remove from strategic parity that we cannot allow. And we'll have to develop missile systems that any missile defense you erect cannot affect. And the response to that is systems like the Burevestnik and the Poseidon and a few others. And that is the culmination. That was a decision by the U.S. and the inevitable response by Russia. And here is the fruit of all of that. It has now come. And that whole missile defense thing hasn't really worked out very well. But the answer to it did, right? The truth of the matter is it's always easier to build a missile that can avoid defense than to build defense that, you know, as a recent movie put it, a bullet knocking a bullet out of the sky, right? Yeah. It's always more expensive and more difficult. But to me, the most interesting is both of these missile systems can be recalled. They're loitering.
Really?
Yes, yeah, you can fire.
No, they loiter because they can
loiter, right? But if you're not going to fire them, you can bring them home then, right?
So you can just have them flying around the world like a
doing circles over the Arctic, whatever, until you fire them. Now here's to me the interesting situation. Let's say in a theoretical exercise that a Tomahawk has been launched towards Moscow out of Kiev regime-controlled territory in Ukraine, right? And the Russian government doesn't know what that warhead is. Let's say they can't stop it. Let's say, right? They've got moments to decide. Is this a potential first strike, right? Is this meant to be a decapitation strike, right? Should we respond with at least one nuclear strike of our own, right? Or however many missiles are hurtling their way. That is a moral decision, and it is an impossible decision to make.
Yeah.
You no longer have to make that decision because you can fire a Burevestnik or a Poseidon and it can do turns. And if it turns out that you bring it down or that it's not nuclear tipped, then you can just bring those babies home and park them in the garage. That is a huge strategic ability that is escaping a lot of people.
I mean, Mark, that's still terrifying. I mean, because the
should be terrifying.
The situation that you're posing.
World. It's more terrifying to think that you might have to fire weapons that you couldn't bring home.
No, agreed. 1000% agreed. But under this premise, a missile is headed towards Moscow. Moscow doesn't know if that's nuclear tipped or not. A Berezhnik is in the sky. It's heading towards a particular target with a nuclear payload. And if that missile hits and it says, okay, well, this is not a nuclear missile, then the nuclear tipped missile that is headed towards some target can be brought back to Moscow. That still means that a nuclear tipped missile was effectively launched at a target.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Jesus.
That's why I say that is a new capability. No one else has that capability. That's impressive. And they can loiter, right? They can loiter like a loitering munition for hours, days, weeks, right? Theoretically.
Yeah.
Like, especially in a location like the Arctic where there's no one there and there's no ability to bring them down, right? You know, that's amazing. And they can go identify, U.S. or, Western air defense, and satellite can identify that air defense, even if it's a ship, right, with missile defense capacity moved to intercept the flight path of that cruise missile. Well, then they just do a wide turnaround, and do an extra spin around South America if they have to. Whatever is necessary to avoid that defense. These are amazing, and it's possible that the Poseidon has actually been finished earlier, and the main problem was a submarine capable of launching them. And that is why the Khabarovsk has been launched this weekend. This is Russia's newest nuclear submarine that was just launched this weekend. Remember, Russia's running out of everything. Apparently not Poseidons and
fighting with shovels.
Brand spanking new Behemoth nuclear stealthy nuclear submarines. And supposedly the Khabarovsk is specifically designed to deliver the Poseidon and can carry up to 6 of them.
Jesus. So you're talking about basically Britain is toast. Various countries on the coast are toast.
The whole eastern seaboard,
Yeah, Virginia, DC,
yep.
Baltimore, Florida.
I have a fondness for Boston. I lived there. That's where I met my wife, actually. So I would spare Boston, but
they're fair game also, Mark. They're fair game also, Mark.
They are. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's a hell of a capability. I mean, they put me in mind of the droplet in 3-body, where these things could just hover and fly and fly forever.
My favorite response was Trump saying, he was reacting angrily about and so he hears about it, and then he immediately orders new nuclear weapons testing, right? Saying that, the Russians and the Chinese are testing nukes. We're going to blow off some nukes. Well, okay, that's false, right? Because Russia and China haven't tested a nuclear weapon. This is you responding to Russia developing new systems, but they still haven't tested a nuclear weapon. These are delivery platforms. It is very different in those terms. But I have to blow up some nukes because I feel testosterone deficient now that you've presented these weapons. So he feels insecure. So he's going to blow off a few nukes, although they may be walking that back right now. But he said that we don't need to go 8,000 miles, like the Burevestnik, which can actually go far more than that. He says, we've got submarines parked right off Russia's coast. We don't need to go 8,000 miles. Well, that's great, except that Russia also has submarines parked right off your coast.
Right.
And they're every bit as capable and stealthy, if not more so than yours, because Russia has forgotten aircraft carriers and everything else and focused most of their naval efforts on their submarine force. And they are top notch. And they have the Burevestnik and the Poseidon. So, on top of that, and you don't have those. That's the end of the line. Yeah. So that was obviously a signal. And, we're again receiving mixed signals because there was this weird statement supposedly coming out of the Pentagon which I don't believe for a second, right? I mean, the Pentagon just doesn't make declarations. This was a political decision from the White House to release this information, that the Pentagon was allowing the delivery of Tomahawk. Like that was ever really a question, but that tells to me that the Trump administration has not completely shelved the idea of the Tomahawks, and that this argument, such as it is, still rages in the White House. They haven't given up on that 100%.
I don't think they have. I don't think they will, frankly. I guess the
last. I don't think they will, and I think primarily they shouldn't, because it just wouldn't help them at all. I mean, it's not that good of a weapon system. They don't have it in enough numbers to make any difference. And how would you launch it? I mean, there's that question as well, right? I mean, it's primarily a ship and air launched cruise missile. Yeah. You've got the U.S. has 2 functioning Typhoon systems, unless they have some smaller, cheaper, less advanced ground-based launch platform. We've seen them presented at certain weapons expos, right? Right. That we're ready to make them. Does the U.S. government already have a number of those? We don't know that, right? But publicly, what we know is the U.S. has 2 advanced ground-based launch systems, the Typhoons, and that's all they have so far. And those things are mobile, but only just. I mean, they're not off-road vehicles, right? And they would have to stick to roads and so forth. I just cannot see the U.S. delivering those to Ukraine.
In numbers, especially in
Russia
numbers.
has demonstrated the capability repeatedly to strike anywhere in Ukraine, right, with hypersonic missiles or anything else it needs to respond immediately to a situation. The time frame between identifying a target and dropping an Iskander on it is phenomenally short now. I just don't. It's not practical. Even in logistical terms, to send it, much less effectiveness, much less Russia's response to it. I think the Trump administration should hang up on the first, just the logistical practicality of sending and using it, much less its effectiveness, much less Russia's response.
Well, that leads to, I guess, my last question, having to do with, well, why expose these two new weapon systems? I mean, for all intents and purposes, agreed that the issue is not necessarily the capability of the Tomahawk. It's the principle behind this idea of firing missiles in Russia in the first place. But they're disclosing two strategic.
Okay, they've already disclosed them. I mean, it has been known for years that these systems were in development. And I'm sure that Western U.S. intelligence gets some type of idea of how far along they are in the development and deployment process as well, right? I mean, U.S. has intelligence. This was a public political declaration, right, that is shoving these weapons in Trump's face, right? Even though they know they're already there, they know that Trump doesn't even read his intelligence, doesn't get his intelligence briefs, because he doesn't. I mean, we've heard that from people within his own administration, right? He gets maybe 1 or 2 intelligence briefs a week, right? And then they have to be presented in big pictures, right? Because he doesn't actually read anything. Right. They're making sure that Trump knows.
But the belief that, I mean, they would have to believe that the United States or that Russia will be willing to use these in response to Tomahawks being used.
I don't even believe that, but
I don't believe that either. That's my point. Precisely my point. How is it a deterrence if there's no belief that the weapon will be used in that context?
That it is still a potential, right? And militaries always have to deal in potentials rather than, they can't automatically assume that for political reasons something won't be used, right? They always have to have contingency as the primary motivation. So there's that. And the very fact that they're talking about it on Fox News makes it a certainty that Trump actually hears it and has to consider it.
Fair enough. Basically, this is stuff that they have to think about, whether they believe it's going to be used or not. It adds additional, let's say, numbers to the equation.
Yeah, it does, right? It's not a guarantee, because, like I said, I don't believe that the U.S. that Russia would fire a Burevestnik if the U.S. fires a Tomahawk at a target in Rostov or wherever. I don't believe it. But you want to deter that from happening, and this helps create a big picture view for the Americans that they can't ignore. So hopefully, that is, again, it's not a certainty, but hopefully it adds to the deterrence equation.
Mark Sleboda, international relations security analyst. You can follow Mark on Boosty, Boosty, at Realpolitik with Mark Sleboda. You can find him on his YouTube channel, also Realpolitik with Mark Sleboda. Definitely check Mark out. He is fantastic. I always call him the best in the business, and I mean it. Mark, always fantastic breakdown, man. Thank you for this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
You have a good one. All right. Great breakdown from Mark. Always a great